In today's video, you're going to learn how to use heart rate variability in your training and 3 best practices that are absolutely fundamental if you're going to make any sense of your heart rate variability data. My guest today has vast knowledge and experience on the topic of heart rate variability and physiological data. So let's hear what Marco Altini has to say. Okay. Hello, Marco. It's such a privilege to welcome you to my channel.
Thank you so much, Martin, for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Now, I've been reading your work on your excellent newsletter and on Twitter for quite a while now. So for that reason, I've been looking forward to this talk with a lot of excitement. For anyone that are listening and haven't yet started using heart rate variability in their training, or they just started but aren't entirely sure about how to go about using it in the best possible way, could you introduce us briefly to what you need to know about heart rate variability in order to make good use of it?
Yeah, I can try. So when we talk about heart rate variability, typically in the context of training, we think about assessing your resting physiology as a marker of stress. So we take a measurement that should capture your body's response to different stressors. Training is one of them. Typically, it's a good application for this type of technology because you can manipulate training in different ways. So if that is the main stressor or the stressor you're trying to respond positively to, you can make some adjustments here and there, and that is not the same sometimes when we think about other stressors that we might have in our work life or family life or sort of other things that might be more difficult to adjust, let's say. So we think about HRV as this overall marker of stress, and we assess it in ways that are typically, I would say at this point, the main two protocols we can use to quantify this response to stress. And that is always at rest, either in the morning as soon as we wake up, or in the night while we are sleeping, if we are using a sensor that captures data at that time. And there are some differences there that maybe later we can discuss. But in general, we think about this type of applications. So we assess resting physiology in a known context, and we try to understand how the body is responding to stressors.
So essentially, this could be a tool to help with the decision making in the day-to-day training and scheduling. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, I would say in the context of maybe making some adjustments here and there, right? So a common misconception at times is that, okay, we use HRV and that is what drives everything in training, every decision. But I think we need to start with a plan first, right? So we know where we want to get, or we have our periodization, and we already have our hard sessions and our easy sessions scheduled and everything in between. And then we look at how the body responds, and we can use HRV to make some adjustments to that plan. We don't use HRV to make up the plan entirely. And this can seem obvious to anyone with experience in training and coaching and things like that. But yeah, I found through the years and working with this technology that it's not always so obvious. People sometimes start measuring. I think, okay, as long as everything is good, I just keep hammering and doing hard sessions and things, and then I wait for my body basically to show me that now I need to rest. And it's not really like that. Like ideally, we want to always be in a good state and still alternate different stimulus. And then sometimes it might be better maybe to postpone a hard session if our body is already too stressed. And that's how we can use HRV maybe for small adjustments.
You mentioned briefly your work, and you have such an interesting professional background. Could you tell us a little bit about how you ended up working in HRV and what it is that you've been doing?
Yeah, so I've started from the technology side, studying computer science and engineering in my master's. And then from there, I ended up in a research institute where basically we were developing prototypes of wearables about 15 years ago. So these sensors to measure the activity of the heart or the activity of the brain or of the muscles. And yeah, something clicked there. I found it really interesting. I thought, wow, computer science is not just about websites and computer networks and things, but you can look at the body and understand what is happening and build technology to do that. And I got really interested in that. I had colleagues working on stress. They would look at the activity of the muscles, for example, near the neck, and the activity of the heart, and different things for office workers that maybe would tense up and things like that. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. And then since I had a background in technology, I could build things, and it was also the right time with the first smartphones, so you could actually build something that anyone could access, not just building it for yourself. So a couple of things I would say fell into the right place at the right time, and I started building tools for people to track heart rate and heart rate variability. HRV for Training is the app I built at this point a decade ago, which is still what the business I run today, and I try to take care of in terms of building the tools and helping people using them. And later on in this journey, as I got to work more with this data and with people using it and with athletes and coaches and so on, I figured, hey, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I don't have the background in physiology and sports science. So I went back to university after doing a PhD also on the technical side of things and machine learning and building models to interpret physiological data. Then later I went back to sports science and studied more in depth also the physiological aspects, which I think helped me a bit in these days trying to communicate these things in a way that cover a bit the technology and the physiology and keep it practical. At the end of the day, I've done plenty of research, but I think I'm a practical person. I like the applied side of things, and I think that's what I try to focus on in terms of the discussions I have and the things I write. I think it's more about, hey, how do we use these things now that the technology is here to make use of them basically in an effective way. Yeah.
That's what I think is so exciting. You have so many legs to stand on in terms of how to assess and apply this knowledge in terms of your data science background, and also you don't just have a degree in sports science. You're also running. You're a fairly avid runner yourself, I know. So you can kind of.
It's let's say very passionate recreational runner. There isn't that much talent to obtain great results, but it's been a long journey, and I try to apply what I learned, and it's been fun, and I like to do that, and endurance exercise has become a big passion of mine, and I like how it allows me also to see on a day-to-day, on a personal level, how the different stressors and the different things you can try impact your body. Yeah.
Do you find in any way that it helps with kind of shaping your work with heart rate variability, having that experience from doing sports or endurance sports running yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I think over the years it's always been a bit like that, like trying things and thinking, hey, this is useful to me, and maybe not only to me. And then I build something, and then it starts, expanding a bit more. So yeah, it's always been part of it. Even in understanding things a bit better. For example, if we step back and look at many years and looking at this data and things like that, and stress, and as my main stressor, I would say, over the years always been work, right? Not training, because that's how I make a living is as a professional, and it's not with training. So I always found that the strongest let's say suppression in HRV, which are associated with increased stress and maybe difficulties in general, we're always deriving from non-training related stressors typically. So from work and other worries and things like that. So I think this whole process helped me a bit also, because then when you build the tools or work with people, you think a bit differently about it. It's not just the training stimulus. There is a whole series of things. And yeah, maybe it's not so obvious when you don't have that same experience. I don't think it's always necessary, right? There's ways to to do things even if you cannot experience them. But in the process of building the tool, for me, has been an important part of it.
I can certainly relate to work being the greatest stressor in life as opposed to training myself. I think a lot of coaches would agree with you very strongly that a lot of at least recreational athletes don't acknowledge the big stressor that work and life outside of training might be. For those that aren't very familiar with heart rate variability, or HRV in short, could you just explain briefly what is heart rate variability? What are we measuring?
Yeah, so when we measure HRV, we look at variations in heartbeats, the time between heartbeats in a certain period of time. That time could be even just 30 seconds. Typically, if you use an app in the morning, it's going to be 1 minute, 2 minutes, few minutes. If you use a device that measures in the night, it can be the whole night. But we always look at the same thing, which is the variation between consecutive heart rates, because the heart does not beat at the constant frequency, right? So even if we have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute, it's not exactly every second that we have a heartbeat. There is some variability in there. And the interesting thing is that variability is due to how your body is responding to stressors under certain conditions. So the variability is due to multiple factors, but if we measure it under certain conditions at rest, like we were saying before, fasting in the morning or in the night, then the autonomic nervous system modulates your heart rhythm. So it basically is responsible for this variability, and the autonomic nervous system responds to stressors in ways that we can capture. So we cannot really quantify stress. We cannot quantify even the autonomic nervous system in non-invasive ways, in particular the parasympathetic side of things, which is what we try to quantify with heart rate variability. But we can look at these things indirectly. So you face a stressor, your autonomic nervous system responds, typically with increased sympathetic activity, reduced parasympathetic activity, and this in turn modulates your heart rhythm so that your heart rate is a bit higher, maybe. I think this everybody knows, right? You're stressed and you feel like your heart rate is racing a bit. HRV is the other way around, so it will be suppressed in that case. And then we see that we can easily and non-invasively measure HRV, and that can give us an insight into this whole series of processes. But this also tells us that it's an indirect measure of what we are really interested in. So there can be other factors behind it, and that maybe is what is making it also more difficult to actually interpret the data in the long term and in relation to all sorts of things, because it's not just maybe the stress response that we are looking at, but other factors that might drive changes in cardiac variability. But that is what we quantify and why we do it.
And perhaps importantly to state is that that variation between heartbeats that you describe is a physiological phenomenon. That's something that happens in a normal, healthy body.
Exactly.
Before we kind of get into the details of how to make use of it, if you were to give any comment on how robust the science underlying the use of heart rate variability in sports science and in training is, how far along are we?
So I would say that the basic principles are well anchored, meaning that if we really isolate training, for example, and look at a very acute level at what happens before, like measuring HRV before training and after training, looking at training at different durations or intensities, what we see is quite obvious in a way, right? We see a suppression due to stress. We see that this is linked to the intensity of the stimulus. We see that this is linked to the fitness of the athlete, meaning that, the normalization of your physiology is quicker, the fitter you are. Like all of these aspects are there when we look at things in a certain controlled environment in the lab, doing certain tests and things like that. And yeah, personally, I really like that. Like it gives me some confidence that, we are looking at something that, okay, it's happening in the body. But from there to then looking at training responses to multiple weeks of training, long-term things, how things change over years, over different stressors combined with everything that happens in life, I think that is more challenging. And the use we make, for example, even in our tools, is very simple because I think we cannot really extrapolate more. And what I mean is that typically we just look at your data with respect to your historical data and try to assess if you are in what is considered a normal physiological state for you based on your recent physiology. And if it's not, it's also unknown why, right? It's maybe because of training, maybe because of another stressor. Like, you need to have the context yourself. Like something, you were mentioning some of the research we did in the past. I thought that one of the interesting things about building these consumer tools were that from the data you could learn something about how the data changes in different contexts and things. And to a certain extent, that is true. But over the years, I got very disillusioned with this idea. I think, like at this point, I don't build the tools for that. While before, maybe I had an interest also in the research and the data side of things. Now, I think the best we can do is really to build the tool for the individual, like so that they collect their own data, they contextualize it meaningfully, and only them can really understand maybe what is going on, because they have all the context that, you just cannot have that context from outside. So I think that is more important, right? To try to look at the data in the right way, add your own context, and look at patterns over time and try to understand things. And I think, from these angles, it's, many things are up for debate, like even what is, an ideal response in a certain training phase or things like that. I think it's, things can go in many different ways and people can still perform better or feel in ways that might or might not be associated with what the data shows. So, actually, I think these two aspects, the fact that there is a clear, reproducible response in certain settings, and the fact that not everything is so obvious when you actually use it in free living, I think these are the two things that keep me still interested. Because, it's not obvious, but it's also not made up. So I'm like, okay, this is something nice to work with. Yeah.
And this kind of brings us to one of the first and very common misconceptions I would argue in using HRV. My absolute HRV is super low, must mean I'm super stressed, not healthy. And I know you've spoken about this quite a bit in different forums, but what can we take anything away from the absolute value that we have?
So I was just having conversations about this the last few days, also on Twitter, with Andrew Flatt, which is a person I really look up to in terms of his knowledge on the topic. And I think it's a really interesting topic. So my opinion in general is that we don't really learn much when we look at our absolute value, because so much is maybe, our genetics or all sort of other things that are even outside of our behavior. And I find that sometimes it can be counterproductive to look at the data in terms of just absolute values compared with others. Like, it doesn't really say much if your HRV is a bit lower than mine or a bit higher than mine, and we both, exercise and get the sleep we need and have a decent diet. And, if you take care of the main things and try not to get too stressed with, work and things, like if you take care of the major things, you might still have a lower HRV than maybe the average person your age being maybe the one factor at the population level where we have a marked change over the years with a reduction as we get older. But otherwise it's not even a good indicator of performance. For example, you could be an elite athlete and have a pretty normal or even lower HRV than many other people. It's not a good marker of your cardiorespiratory fitness, the way even heart rate can be, at least at the population level, right? We all know that if we take an homogeneous sample of people, all good athletes or all recreational athletes or just sedentary individuals, it will not tell us much. But if we look at the resting heart rate of people of different characteristics, then it tracks well with maybe their VO2 max or other ways to track their performance. HRV doesn't track that well even with that. So it's a bit of a different thing. That's why I see in a more useful light when we look at it in the context of tracking relative changes with respect to our own baseline and the stressors that we face. I think that becomes a practical and useful way for anyone to use it, regardless of our absolute HRV. So this is how I see it in general. This being said, it doesn't mean that you cannot do things to potentially increase your HRV. Maybe there are situations in which you're young and your HRV is particularly low, and maybe there are some behavioral or lifestyle choices that you can make to slightly improve it. And normally I just really think about the basics that we said before. So maybe it's really just about moving around, exercising, and again, what we are eating and how we sleep, and again, work-related stressors, things like that. But yeah, I struggle to focus too much on the absolute value because I think a lot of people already do those things and they're perfectly fine. And then they might end up, stressing about their data and the absolute value of their data, which I don't think is necessarily something indicative of something negative, given how broad are the ranges of groups of people that belong to different categories, right? Even in the studies where we look at people, I saw one just the other day, people diagnosed with depression and healthy controls, and you would look at the differences between these two groups, and the overlap was almost complete, meaning that both groups started maybe in the tens milliseconds and ended in, I don't know, the 80 milliseconds in terms of RMSSD, this common HRV value. And yeah, again, it was basically the same values, which means that given the value, you can never say if this person belongs to, the healthy group or the people that have a certain condition. So again, I think like many things HRV, we don't have a perfect answer. I think the absolute values might mean something, but it's not healthy to overly focus on them or obsess over them. And yeah, they're easier and more practical way to use HRV in a way that can work for you, I think, is to look at how you respond to different stressors so that you can make some adjustments and keep things more stable maybe over time in terms of HRV as opposed to aiming to increase it. I will just add one thing. There's so many things that impact HRV in the long term, and I think, for example, about seasonality. So it is common for HRV to be a bit higher in summer and lower in winter for people that live in places where you have seasons. And then if you start a good healthy behavior and it's a few months before winter, and then your data tracks negatively, maybe even, right? I don't think that's a useful way to look at it, right? It doesn't mean that your healthy behavior is not good. It just means that there's other factors behind the absolute value of HRV, and maybe it's more useful if we look really at the day-to-day, short-term sort of stress response. Maybe I overexerted myself in this training session, and next time I balance the intensity a bit better. Or maybe I ate this thing or drank too much or this other thing, and it's maybe that is also something that I can skip next time. Or maybe I traveled to altitude and I learned that it takes me this many days to renormalize. Like that's the way we can use the data in the short term, relative changes that I think is more useful than the absolute ones. But yeah, this I don't know, a topic that I think is really up for debate. This currently how I see it.
Yeah. The very simple advice would be to be more concerned with your relative changes in contrast to your baseline, as opposed to what your absolute value is.
Yeah, it's something that's maybe not try to compare with too many other people, and just look at what data changes and try to learn from that over time. Yeah.
A related question goes, but before our talk today, I wrote an Instagram post asking people what questions they wanted answered on the topic of HRV, and a lot of people wrote back. They wondered if there was a correlation between your HRV absolute values and fitness level. And I think the answer to that is pretty short, isn't it?
I started to say we addressed that a bit. I think not so much. So it
Yeah.
doesn't, it doesn't really strongly, it's not strongly associated to your fitness level. I've actually published data on this in different capacities, but recently we looked at the population level at even just in relation to the amount of physical activity you do across different age groups, from people in their 20s to people in their late 50s. And you can clearly see that depending on the activity level, the heart rate was really just showing a very strong correlation with the activity level at any age group. So it doesn't matter if you are, 59 or 21. If you exercise every day, your heart rate is, 50, so to speak. If you never exercise, it's 80. And you could really see that across the board. If you look at HRV, you don't have that relationship anymore. There's the effect of aging. There's different factors in there. I think fitness is not captured as well. In our tools, we have a model to estimate VO2 max. So when we built this model, obviously we looked at the best predictors, and we included resting heart rate because it was helpful together with training data. Training data obviously is much more helpful because you actually see your internal load at a certain external load while you're not just sitting there, but you're exercising. So much more useful data. But HRV didn't make it to the model because it was just not so predictive of it.
So not a strong predictor for fitness at all then.
Yeah.
You mentioned resting heart rate, and when I was a fair bit younger, this was the one parameter that we were told to track in order to gauge our recovery status. And you recently wrote a great chapter in a very recent book about individualized training and wearable technology, where you touch on the topic of the differences between resting heart rate and heart rate variability and their different uses. How do they differ, and to what degree do they differ, and why do we need to consider both? Do we need to consider both?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I think there are differences, and I wouldn't say one is superior to the other. It depends a bit what you're looking at. When we go through the trouble of looking at HRV, which is a bit more complex and more prone to artifact and a sort of potential issues, I think we need to have a good reason, and that good reason should be that HRV is a bit of a more sensitive marker. That means that in certain situations, specifically, I would say in the context of training, that is not the strongest stressor. If we think about things like sickness, for example, which is, a much stronger stressor on the body. If we look at HRV, it can capture your response better than heart rate, meaning that you might see changes that you don't see in heart rate. Heart rate might change by very little. If we go back to this idea of your normal range, what's your normal heart rate in the past few weeks, it will be within a few beats. And then on a given day, maybe you have changes that are always so small that it never gets out of what is considered normal for you. While in HRV, if there is a stressor that your body has not really responded well, you will see a suppression outside of your normal range, so it will be easier to capture these changes. So I think one of the reasons to look at HRV would be that it's a more sensitive marker of stress. Using both can be informative because, for example, if we face a very strong stressor or if we are getting sick, typically this will show up also in heart rate. So if we see maybe very high heart rate and suppressed HRV, then we might think, hey, something is going on here. Maybe, you really take it easy, or you just wait it out, even don't go to work or whatever, and you see, if you're actually developing some symptoms and things like that, it can be a useful information. If your heart rate is normal, but my HRV is suppressed, maybe I think, hey, I don't know, maybe it's something, triggered the response, but I am less concerned for my health, right? It could be just a combination of factors. We talked before about fitness, right? So maybe you pick up exercise and you start making some changes, and then if you change dramatically your habits, I think in many situations both parameters might change in a similar way, but in opposite directions. So your heart rate might reduce a bit, your HRV might increase. It could also be that you just see changes in resting heart rate and your HRV does not necessarily change. In that case, HRV remains useful for this day-to-day feedback, even though it's the long run is not tracking your fitness. So there are always some of these differences that I think can be insightful. The reason for these differences, I think, physiologically, is that in theory, parasympathetic activity is basically active and higher during the exhale phase of the breathing cycle. So when we quantify variability over a period of time, then if we look just at heart rate, we sort of average out these changes because your heart rate will become slower as you breathe out and faster as you breathe in. So if you take the average, this information is lost. While when you look at HRV, you can see these changes because that is actually what you go and quantify, and that allows you to capture in a more sensitive way the response of the parasympathetic system and therefore your response to stressors. So I think that's why we look into it despite the challenges. And yeah, eventually I think both markers can be helpful to track stress responses, changes in fitness, and resting physiology in general.
That's a great transition, I would say. Essentially, we're trying to quantify heart rate variability in one way or another. What are the different numbers or features that we can get as an output in making that attempt at quantifying it?
Yeah, so there's way too many, I would say, maybe 60, 70, even more. So that's why HIV research is so tricky. In many papers, you will find that there was a difference in HIV for something because they tested like 80 different features, maybe without any statistical correction or anything like that, right? And I think we always need to be careful there. One of the good things that happened, I think, in the field of HRV in the past decade, together with the ease of use of the technology, is that things got more standard from the point of view of which metrics to look at. And in particular, there is one that is called RMSSD, which looks at these high frequency changes that is now reported, I would say, by pretty much any sensor. Most sensors report only this feature, and in research, I think it's also going in that direction. Most of the research looks at this marker or reports this marker. Many papers recently started looking specifically just at this, together with resting heart rate, instead of looking at everything. And I think that's that helps because we look at something that has a clear link to parasympathetic activity because of how it is computed mathematically, which captures these high frequency changes. At the same time, it's simple to compute. So any manufacturer of a sensor or an app can do it in the same way. That works very well. And yeah, I would say I would look at this RMSSD feature as the one that is a good indicator of your parasympathetic activity. So a lower value shows a poor stress response or more stress on your body. And that is, probably the most indicative parameter.
And if I remember correctly, that's also one that you're using in your app, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So in the app, the first number you see is actually a transformation of this. So just to make it a bit simpler in a scale that is more or less a decimal scale, but the number is not a combination of things. It's just a transformation of your RMSSD. And you can also look at your RMSSD. So this was a choice we made many years ago. I think, honestly, if I had to do it now, I would just show RMSSD directly. In the early days, it was maybe thought to be more confusing. So we did this transformation. The good news is that it's just a transformation. So everything you see in terms of day-to-day changes, trends, and so on, is accepting the same between the two parameters.
And if we were to get a bit more hands-on, I guess I think the questions that a lot of people are wondering is what tools should we be using in terms of wearables, and how should we be testing, and how should we interpret it? And I was so excited when I read through your chapter in in this book that I mentioned. You laid all of that out in such an eloquent way. And you mentioned 3 points that sort of I interpreted as kind of best practices in using HRV. And you mentioned to measure accurate data and to measure meaningful data and also to interpret the data correctly. Could you elaborate a little bit on each of the 3?
Yeah. So I think the first one, measuring accurate data, is something people understand and can relate to, and often what they look for, and maybe do not pay too much attention to the other 2 points, which are though really important, because the accurate data becomes meaningless if we do not measure at the meaningful time and interpret the data correctly. So I think the 3 points all are important. The accurate data simply means that when you say you're measuring something like your heart rate or your MSSD in terms of HRV, you're actually measuring that thing, and you can validate that with a reference system. So if we talk about HRV, we take an ECG like it is used in the hospital with electrodes and everything, or maybe even just a chest strap like a polar strap, which is also as accurate, but at the beginning also that needed to be validated against a full ECG. And then we compare it with the wearable. For example, we take a Whoop band or an Oura ring or our app that uses the camera or these kind of things, or a Garmin. People have different sensors these days, and we take a measurement intentionally with all of them at the same time, and we see, okay, does the data match? When we do this on a broad enough number of people that have very different maybe HRV values, can we capture a 15 milliseconds MSSD and a 250 milliseconds MSSD with these technologies? And that, if we can do that, that's great. And the good news is that technology has improved a lot. And when we measure at rest, we're not moving. We can capture this data accurately with a number of different things: a phone camera, a chest strap, a ring wearable, a wrist wearable, all these sort of things. They all can measure accurately under the right conditions, which means absolutely no movement. As soon as you move around, even just contract some muscles, like you will create artifacts and the data will be a mess. That is why I think HRV needs to be measured under certain conditions and not continuously, for example, as unfortunately wearables are also doing these days. So let's stick to the measurements at rest, and those can be accurate. Then measuring at a meaningful time, that means that, again, we are trying to assess your body's response to stress. And it makes sense to do that only at rest and after some time has passed since you had experienced a stressor, because it is perfectly normal for your physiology to be impaired when you exercise, for example, when you face a stressor. And then it's also perfectly normal that it takes time for it to renormalize. But if something is off, you can measure it 10 hours later and it will still be off. That's why you need that time to pass to give time to your body to renormalize. You cannot get worried or stressed all the time because you've moved around and your physiology is altered. That is perfectly normal. Stress is good, and training is good. Acutely, it shows as really bad. Like your heart rate is very high and your HRV is very suppressed, but chronically it will make you better. So we cannot look at things so acutely and think that we can interpret the stress response. We need to measure after a while and see if you have renormalized with respect to, again, your normal range or not. And that's why we need to do it first thing in the morning, or we can do it in the night as we sleep. I think that both these methods are fine. Typically, the reason to go with one or the other is, for many people, just practical. Many people maybe forget to measure in the morning, or other people do not like to wear a sensor. So, you have your setup that works for you. We need to be aware of some differences I think are important. If you measure in the night, of course, you're measuring earlier. The night comes before the morning. So if you have stressors in the evening, you train in the evening, or you eat late, or all sort of things, that might impact your physiology in a way that it will show up negatively, so to speak, like suppression in HRV or increased heart rate. But that is not necessarily bad. It's just that you measured much earlier, closer to the stressor. And if you were to measure in the morning, maybe everything was perfectly fine and nothing to worry about. So we just need to understand that there is a timing difference there, And if your routine is very standard and always the same, and you eat 3-4 hours before going to bed, and you never drink, and you never exercise in the evening, and all of these things, sometimes then the night data and the morning data are exactly the same, even over periods of many months, right? I saw this even in my data, but then there are other periods where it's very different. And I don't think you need to overthink it when you have a suppression in the night. For example, something that happens to me all the time before a big day of training or a race. I eat more carbs in the evening. Sometimes I also eat later, or eat more if I'm a bit hungry, because I don't want to go to bed hungry on those occasions, right? And then my night data is always terrible, so to speak, according to the wearables, because my heart rate is elevated, my HRV is a bit lower, but in the morning it's all fine. So I think these kind of things we need to understand so that we don't stress over something that is definitely fine. Just your body is just taking some time to renormalize, and then it's gonna be fine. So measure with an accurate device and measure at a meaningful time, first thing in the morning or in the night, trying to understand the differences. I will add just one thing about the measurement protocol. I think one more reason to measure in the morning, in my opinion, would be that you can measure in a different body position. That is also important, not just the timing, but also how you measure. If you measure in the night, of course, you're lying down. In the morning, you can also sit up. If you sit up, you rely on what we call the orthostatic stressor. It simply means that you sit up and your body responds also to that and readjusts. And if you measure shortly after, your stress response is somewhat amplified. So it becomes even more sensitive to the stressor. Yeah. It happened to me, for example, that, I was acutely sick just one night. And in my data, in the night, my heart rate was elevated. Maybe, 10 beats above my normal range. But then if I sit up and I measure, my heart rate is maybe 30 BPMs higher, right? It's an enormous difference just because you add that stressor. And in the following day, in the night, it was just, again, within my normal range. While sleeping in that highly parasympathetic state, I was perfectly normal. But then I sit up in the morning and it's maybe 15 beats higher the second day and, 10 the third day. And I could really see, just in heart rate, not even looking at HRV, how the body was getting over that day of sickness. And I could see it only in sitting data. So I think, especially in the context of training where, you want to be more sensitive to try to capture the stressor and not just look at the data in the very long term or in relation to your health, then it might be useful to do it that way. Again, if you measure only twice per week because you always forget, then maybe it's better to just measure in the night. But if it's something you can fit in your routine, I think that can be best. The last point we had, apart from measuring accurately and meaningfully, was to measure, to interpret your data correctly. And to interpret your data correctly typically means with respect to your normal range. So use a tool where you can collect data every day, and then it basically builds this frame of reference for you, which is based on your historical data. And that is always updated over time because, again, our physiology changes for a number of reasons. So you cannot be stuck with a frame of reference that, you had when you started measuring many months ago. It is always updated, and it gives you simply this frame of reference to determine where you're standing today. Because, as you were saying before, in the context of absolute values, there is really no frame of reference that is universal, right? So we have that for certain parameters. If we look at blood pressure or blood glucose or many other things we can measure, we know there is a certain range where we are supposed to be within, and debatable if that is really the case for everyone, but still that is what we learn. And then with HIV, it's not really like that. There isn't that range, and then you need to use your historical data to build that range for you so that when something is stressing you out and your body is not responding well, you have a suppression below your own normal range and you can identify that. And that's, I think, how eventually you can make use of the data.
How long of a baseline would you recommend collecting before you can start getting meaningful interpretation out of the daily changes?
In our tools, we use 2 months. I think that a few weeks is enough. In studies, typically they use 1 month, so a bit of a shorter normal range, let's say. I think that has something to do also with how running a study is not so easy. You need people to comply and do things, and maybe, just 1 month is easier than 2 months. There is no obviously right answer here. I think there are trade-offs that also that we need to understand. Say we use just a few days, then you're always renormalizing your data with respect to what happened really recently. So if you were maybe sick for a week, then the app or the tool would think that HRV or heart rate of when you're sick is your normal, which of course is not. So we cannot just use a few days.
Yeah.
At the opposite end, if we use a very long window, maybe 6 months, then we might use data that is very old and not really representative of your state today, maybe even because it's just another season or things like that. So I think anything between 30 and 60 days plays between these two extremes and gives you a decent frame of reference to capture changes in a meaningful way.
I know that your app has a great presentation graphically of the fluctuation within the normal reference ranges from your baseline, but how much deviation is meaningful? How big does the difference need to be before it's relevant or something to consider as a worthwhile change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And another one where I think just like the amount of data you use, the way you capture a meaningful change is also something maybe up for debate and not set in stone. We use one standard deviation of your data in these 60 previous days. I think most papers also use something like that or very close to that. I think it depends a bit also what you want to focus on. For example, if you want to look at the daily change, then the daily data has higher variability than the weekly average by definition, right? Because the weekly average is looking at, it's a smooth version of what is happening. So if we look at the daily data, maybe we use one standard deviation. And then, on the web, we have this other tool where you look at your data more in the long term. And there we want to focus more on the baseline changes, so the weekly average changes. And so there maybe we use 0.75. So it's narrower because we don't really care too much about the daily data, but we want to see, when the baseline is changing towards different sides of your normal range. So there also, I think, if someone is looking at their data or building their tools, there is some freedom to decide how to do this. Obviously, the wider you take it, the fewer changes will be detected as meaningful. So then it depends a bit also how you want to do that. Yeah.
You mentioned the 1 or 0.75 standard deviations. For those who aren't very well trained in the statistics, could you explain just briefly what is a standard deviation?
Well, it's just a measure of the variability in the data, the spread in the data. So if we collect data every day, your data will not be the same every day. There will be always some variations. So if you cover a range that maybe is between 14 and 70 milliseconds in MSSD, and then we take one standard deviation of how this data is distributed over time. I think that should be more or less, 67% of your range if the data was normally distributed. And that allows you basically to determine what is the range in which we consider your data to be normal, which is not the full range, but it's just where most of your data is. And then when you're outside of this range, then we consider that something to flag because maybe there's more stress on your body.
Finally, the one question that everyone asks, if we go back to the accuracy of data, which tools, which watches, which gadgets are valid and accurate?
All right, so that have been validated. There is the polar straps that you can pair with different apps, for example, ours, but also others. There's our app also in terms of the measurement with the camera. So in HRV for training, we ran validations, and later was also independently validated together with the Aura Ring that as well was validated. I think the Whoop Band has also been shown to capture data correctly. And in my experience, when I tested all of these devices, they all also worked as advertised. So you can collect accurate data in the right context. Myself, I've tested also Garmin and Chorus watches, and I think that both of them are also good at this point for night data. The Chorus watch, I like it particularly because it allows me to take a snapshot, and I know Garmin can also do that. At the moment, I don't have Garmin, so I haven't tested that. But they tell me it has that feature. So I think that is nice because you can also take the morning snapshot and then read it in our hours aware. So with as an endurance athlete, I think these days there is no need for a wearable that is not your GPS watch, right? Because they cocked up with the technology, and maybe 3-4 years ago it was not like that, but now they're equally good. So I would say it's more important that you measure at the right time and interpret the data correctly. And most of the common devices these days are accurate. So yeah, that was good improvements in the technology.
Great, thanks, Marco. That's useful. That's very useful insight. That was the accuracy, but then in terms of the interpretation and how the different gadgets deals with the information they collect, are there any differences there that we need to be aware of? I'm just asking because I just read one of your tweets or threads on Twitter or X that I found really interesting, where you used an example of your own, where there was quite a discrepancy between your morning measurement and the recommendations from some of the tools that you used.
Yeah, that's right. So I think the main issue we have with this type of data and the interpretation these days is how it is used in what are readiness or recovery scores that are typical in wearables. I think there, we have issues that come from different points of view. One is simply that we are mixing things. So when we create one of these scores, we mix your physiology and your behavior. And when we add your behavior in these models, we make assumptions. So the tools make assumptions about how a certain behavior should relate to your readiness or recovery. For example, if you sleep less, you will always be penalized with a lower score. But that does not mean that your physiology is even altered in any way. So I think these scores, while maybe well-meaning at a certain point as a way to simplify things and help people use the data, eventually are doing us a bit of a disservice because we end up not really looking at how our body is responding to things, but we look at the result of a model that makes generic assumptions that might not relate to our specific case. So I think that's a pity because those things are the first thing you see in these tools and apps. So I would encourage people to look at the data, try to look at the actual physiology, how it changes over time, and sort of ignore everything that is made up on top that is not really necessarily related to how their physiology is changing. And I think that is probably the main issue and why I try to spend some time talking about these things.
Yeah, that's again very useful insight, and I think you do indeed spend a lot of time, from what I can see, talking about this in social media and on your newsletters. I would just recommend everyone to go and have a look at your X or Twitter account and also your newsletter. I'll make sure I put the link in the description below. There was one more thing I was wondering, and obviously HRV is it's one tool that we can use in order to get some sense of idea about how stressed the body is or how ready we are in terms of doing a new session. But obviously there are other parameters that we could also use to make these decisions, such as your training history. How have you been loading your body with training stress lately, in terms of absolute training load, subjective feel, whatnot. There are lots of parameters that we could use. In your experience, how does HRV fit into this picture, and how do you use it together with all the other parameters that you could be using?
Yeah. I think HRV is useful when we combine it with other parameters. It should not replace, objective data is not there to replace subjective data, right? Certain things cannot be quantified by HRV that I think are a huge limiter, especially in sports and endurance sports. One of the main limiters that you have will be muscular soreness, right? You will do a session and you will be really sore and you just cannot do the same session the day after. If your HRV is perfectly normal the second day, that is great. It means that you responded well to that stimulus. It does not mean that you can repeat it, right? So I think that also speaks a bit to what we were saying before about these readiness or recovery scores. Like they give you the false impression that they aggregate all this data to tell you how you can perform what you can do. It's just not possible because things that are so important like muscle soreness, it just will never be captured by that data. So that's why we need to use the data for what it can do. And in this context, it will be, hey, I had a good stress response, but I did a session yesterday, and obviously my plan does not put a session for me today if I'm not the type of person that can handle 2 sessions in a row. Again, depending on the factors that you mentioned, our history and previous training and things like that. So I think it's just one piece that we can try to incorporate sometimes simply as this type of feedback, like, okay, we are responding well to the program. We continue as we are going, as we planned. Or maybe sometimes we see suppressions or sustained suppressions over multiple days, and then we know that something is not going well. That might be in line with how we feel, or it might not, and it could still be a useful indication that it might be useful to make some changes. And there are some studies showing, for example, that when you use HRV to guide training, meaning that you just make this small adjustment to your periodization in which you reduce intensity when HRV is suppressed, then groups that did that perform better or equally to groups that just kept doing the hard sessions despite training less hard, right? So you don't do all those sessions and then you do the same or you do better. That tells us that there is something to timing of the stressor, not only the type of the stressor. And maybe HRV in that context can help us. If your body is so stressed already, you're not going to respond well, and you make a small adjustment. But always integrated with subjective feel. And yeah, I would say that is probably the main thing. And of course, your training plan.
Yep. You mentioned some studies that are quite interesting. I think I'll look up those references that you've been referencing in your chapter, and then also put them in the comments below for anyone that are interested in geeking and reading the original literature themselves. Are there any particular papers that would be like must read for people that are interested in this?
Well, there is older literature that I think is really good from Martin Boucher and Daniel Pius. All the papers they wrote maybe 10 years ago are the foundations of the applied work on HRV that is today in wearables and sensors and apps. So it's not, the theoretical work on HRV of 50 years ago, but it's really applied for sports science in times in which it was not so easy to collect the data, but it really looked at a lot at all of these trends, introduced what we call now the normal range and all these things. So I think those are great. And then some of the recent studies that you were mentioning that are probably maybe also in the chapter that are more about the HRV guided training. I think that is a step that came later. So how to use the data to make small adjustments. There's a Seiler paper from 2007 that I really like. That is the one that goes back to the basics that we discussed at the very beginning. So looking at HRV before and after training, in the context of people of different fitness and of sessions of different intensities. I think that is a really a key paper to understand why we are even bothering with this. Like it shows that you see the responses you expect. So I think that's a good read for people that are more into the scientific literature. I can send you some links later in case it's needed.
Thanks a lot. I think a lot of people find that interesting, so I'll make sure they get at least the links to a handful of those papers. Finally, where do you see the science of an application of HRV going the next couple of years? Are there any particular applications or developments that we're needing or that you think will make a big difference in the years to come?
So I'm curious to see if we get to understand a bit better the whole absolute values and how much can you change your HRV, or what interventions can lead to changes in these metrics, and more importantly, if that is then associated to differences in health or performance outcomes, right? Because HRV is just a marker, but we want to see then what happens to our health or to our performance. So in the past 10 years, technology got so much better that now these things are very easy to track and people can try things and scientists can do studies that they could not do before. But I think we are very rudimental still in terms of interventions and things. And when we do them, we never know what's going to happen basically to the individual. So how can we help the individual in a way that is effective to them and things like that? I think something I hope we can learn more in the future.
Very excited to see how that goes myself as well. I think we've covered a lot of things, Marco. I think I'm probably going to draw the line there, but I just wanted to say big thank you for taking your time to come and have a chat to me today. I really appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. I think this was a really good conversation. I think we covered a lot of good topics, and I hope it will be useful to people.
Thank you. I'm very sure it will. And finally, I also just want to recommend everyone to go and have a look at your app. It comes with a one-time fee only, so it's quite lenient in terms of investment compared to a lot of other options out there. So, link is below. Thanks again, Marco, for coming, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much. You too.